It was 1994, and a young college student named Jay Gupta in India had an idea. He'd read an article in a business magazine that the retailing sector was going to grow like crazy, and that the rising middle class, the fast-growing middle class in India, was going to make retailers rich. Well, Gupta said, that's maybe what I should do. So in 1994, he opened a store, but it wasn't really a store. It was just some exhibitions and some rented retail space, a very small rented retail space in Mumbai, where he was studying. He did 4 exhibitions, and what he did was he asked vendors of Western apparel that was growing in importance in India to give him goods on consignment. He would sell as much as he could, and he would return the rest and pay for it when he was done. So this little tiny business that consisted of 4 exhibitions was funded on his vendors' cash. The customers would come in, the customers would pay him cash for what they bought, and he would pay the vendors later and return what was unsold. Well, as a result of these exhibitions, Gupta learned some important lessons. Number 1, he learned what kind of things sold and what kind of things didn't. Number 2, he learned what kind of salespeople worked and what kind of salespeople didn't, and he learned that not every customer who came into the store would actually buy. So eventually, Gupta decided, I'm going to buy that location. So with a loan from his family, he bought the little store and got into business full-time. But of course, that meant he had to get merchandise. So he went to several vendors and said, I'd like to do a franchise store for you in Mumbai, but they wouldn't do it. He was an untested college graduate just out of school. Nobody would let him open an exclusive store, but he did convince a few vendors to let him take some of their merchandise and open a multi-brand store, which was unusual in India at the time. So the Casual Plus store went into business and began doing business with consumers. Gupta soon observed that customers wanted a wider range of assortment, more goods than he had in his tiny store. So he said, I wish I could open a bigger store. So he went to his vendors and said, would you allow me now, you've seen my track record, would you allow me now to open a franchised store selling just your goods in a larger space? Well, he convinced 4 Western vendors and a couple of Indian ones as well to let him do just that. So he opened over the next couple of years 4 franchised outlets that began to grow. He discovered that business in these larger stores with more complete product ranges was much better than the business in the small multi-brand store. But as he went along, he discovered that customers still weren't fully happy. They wanted discounts. Indian customers love discounts, and of course, Gupta was selling in these franchised outlets at full retail price. So Gupta had an idea. He went to Adidas, one of his vendors, and said, you know, I think there's a need for a franchised factory outlet store that will sell seconds and closeouts and things that you can't get rid of in your full-price stores, because after all, every vendor makes too much of some styles and they have to be disposed of. So Adidas let him open the first of these franchise stores. Well, very quickly the sales took off. Indian consumers loved the franchise format with the discount prices, and very quickly he discovered that this was a format that worked. In fact, the sales in his first year in the Adidas outlet were more than $1 million US. Though Gupta was thrilled with his performance in the new store, his customers always wanted more. They said, yeah, this is great, but wouldn't it be great if we had lots of brands here, not just Adidas, and if we could have the depth of assortment we have here, plus a breadth of assortment, all at fabulous discount prices. So Gupta opened his 4th retail format, and he called it the Loot. And the idea was this. In the Loot, he would steal the best goods from the best Western and Indian resources, and he'd offer them to consumers at discounts ranging from 25% to 60% every day. Well, very quickly, the Loot store took off. It did 4 times the volume of any of his earlier franchises, and Gupta knew he was really onto something. So very quickly, he flipped all of his stores to the Loot format. But along the way, he made a change that he didn't fully understand. Previously, his strategy had been to take goods on consignment, which meant that the business could be customer funded. He had growing bank lines to cover some of his costs, but most of his costs were covered by the customer's funds because after all, in a retail format, the customer pays, and in India they pay with cash, and he wasn't paying his vendors because it was consignment goods until after the goods had sold. So it was a great model. But in the Loot, though sales were terrific, in order to get the goods, the discount goods, he had discovered that if he offered to pay in advance to the vendors, he could get even better prices and get great discounts that he'd pass on to the consumers. Well, what Gupta hadn't understood was that changing the timing with which he paid his vendors was going to give him a significant problem. So in 2004, when he flipped 8 of his stores to the new Loot format, his cash flow all of a sudden became a huge problem. The banks were helping him finance the inventory, and that went a long way, but Gupta was always short of cash. Well, along the way, he began talking with the father of a friend of his, a man named Chabra, who had been a banker for his career and was retired. But he was kind of bored, and Chabra and Jay began having conversations in the evening over tea about the development of Loot's business. Well, one thing led to another, and Chabra soon came on board, first as an advisor, and then Gupta asked him to be CEO. They raised some capital, just a small amount of capital, strengthened their bank lines, hired some people, put some systems into place, and the business began to grow. But by the time it got to 15 stores, once again, the business had plateaued. Loot was having trouble opening stores outside of Mumbai because of local and regional differences and because of the challenges in dealing with local officials and rent and local regulations and all those kinds of things outside of the city of Mumbai. Gupta really didn't know how to solve this problem until one day he got a letter from a man named Desai. Desai proposed that he would franchise the Loot's name from the Loot, and Loot would provide the merchandise and the store format, just as its stores in Mumbai were, but Desai would own and operate the store and, of course, would own all the inventory in the store. The light bulb went off in Jay Gupta's mind. Was this the way to begin to really grow the business, using somebody else's funds? The franchisee would invest in the store, would do the advertising, would build the business, and Loot would only have to buy the merchandise, but of course it would have growing buying power and be able to get even better deals. Well, the franchise model worked, and very quickly the business began to grow. It grew from the original 15 stores that were all owned by the Loot to 155 stores scattered widely around India. But along the way, something had happened. In 2008, a new law was passed changing the tax regime in India that would affect retailers. In 2009, another law was passed, and in 2010, there was yet another law, each of them putting in place a different tax, a value-added tax, a service tax, and excise tax. Well, the retailing industry in India was up in arms because they didn't like this new taxation. They thought it interfered with their business model, so the industry complained, and the courts put the new taxes on hold. The retailers expected to win the case. So Jay, expecting the courts to rule in the industry's favor, went along with business as usual. Well, in 2010, the courts decided the taxes would in fact stay in place, so overnight, Gupta owed back taxes from 2008, 2009, 2010 for all the business he'd done with these now 155 franchise stores, and of course he had no cash to pay it. So what happened thereafter? The business quickly unwound. Gupta had to learn not how to grow a business, but how to shrink it. He'd go to his vendors and say, I know I owe you money, I have no cash. I've got a lot of t-shirts. How many t-shirts would you like? The business shrank back to 5 stores by 2013, and Gupta was pondering what he should do next. So as we can see, these customer-funded businesses can work and can grow. And sometimes finding funding in another way, from outside or in Loot's case, from franchises, can help it grow further. But at the end of the day, the business model still has to work. Customer funding is not a panacea, and if the business model doesn't work, you're going to be asking for trouble.